going as I can.
So if you're trying to keep up with the count, he's talked about three things so far on his personal program, his personal prescription, if you will. And he actually uses that phrase later on in the presentation, and hopefully we'll be able to get to that part. That is cognitive behavioral therapy, exercise, and working with peers. And not only working with peers in terms of him as a psychologist helping other individuals with issues of depression, but the other way around as well, getting help from other individuals who have different experiences that he can learn from. It works both ways.
That's my story, and that's how I got to relative state of wellness. I mean, I have some bad days. I still have some pretty difficult habits. My worst habit probably right now is I stay up late, later than I should, and I stuff my face with carbohydrates. Becoming someone who was a peer, working with other people, having help from other people, made a tremendous difference, and it really it hit me so strongly that over time I thought, this is what I really want to do. I want to empower as many peers and get as many groups going as I can.
And that's what Vince Caimano set out to do, and that's what then the end result of which is Support Groups Central. It's a tremendous service. It's an interactive service. You're going to hear more about that later on in the broadcast in the next few minutes. Now we're going to skip ahead a little bit to what Vince Caimano talks about in terms of how all of these menu items, as he describes it, and there's a ton of them, and you can find them. He has a slideshow, and he was actually going through a slideshow as he was presenting this information at this talk that you're listening to a portion of. There are a ton of things on this menu, three of which you've already heard about. Now we're going to fast forward a bit and talk about and listen to what Vince Caimano says about how they all fit together in light of the kinds of changes that your brain actually goes through.
Type 1 is, and then of course bipolar disorder, which is more difficult, I think, in a lot of ways, difficult for loved ones to deal with often.
That was the wrong piece. Here we go.
My issue with depression was major depressive disorder, and that's probably the most common type, and it's a huge, huge problem. The World Health Organization says that this will become the second biggest disease burden in the world by 2020. What they mean by disease burden is that it impacts people's productivity. It takes them away from work. It makes them really frustrated with regard to getting things done. Makes sense, right? And all of that is costly. And it's not just the treatment cost, but it's also the loss of potential in people who suffer with depression. The big concern, of course, is always suicide, that's such an awful problem. I mean, part of what I hope is that in my work that somehow we're reaching out to people who are contemplating suicide and we can help them to not take that step. What's going on with our brains when we're depressed? First, let's think about our brains in general. They're marvelous devices that we have between our ears. We have in our brains over 100 billion neurons. And those neurons have over 1 quadrillion connections. So our brains are marvelous, complex things. When we're depressed, it's true that neurotransmitter levels go down, but it's true that our brain is constantly changing and constantly active, even when we think it's not very active. We talk to ourselves at a rate of 200 or 300 words a minute. And so that's just like when we're at idle. where there's always all this chatter, always all this activity. And yes, things change in our brain from time to time. When we're depressed, not only do those neurotransmitter levels go down, but if you have a lot of depression like I did, and this is what caused me to feel so stuck at first when I started to really look at depression and depression treatment, is the physicality of your brain actually changes. The other thing that's really, really important is that despite all of the advertising that you see for antidepressants, no one knows what really causes depression. And despite all of the brain research that's going on, no one has really come up with a cause. The first thing that happens to our brains if we have a lot of experience with depression is that the prefrontal cortex starts to not work as well. And that's like the executive branch of your brain. That orchestrates a lot of things. So if that's not working well, your brain is going to be kind of wobbly. Another thing that happens is the amygdala, which is the seat of emotions in your brain. That doesn't work as well either. You get more emotional. And then the last thing that happens is that the hippocampus stops creating new neurons, or neurogenesis is diminished. Because of that, our brain is less healthy. It's harder to learn things. It's harder to make use of our brain because, the cells in our body are constantly dying and we need to replenish those. So that's true in the brain as well. We need new neurons. And if you have a lot of depression, that part of your brain doesn't work as well.
From there, and this part of his presentation, Vince Caimano goes on to talk about some of the other dynamics that individuals who he works with deal with and have expressed to him, some of which are genetics. The idea that depression, for a lot of people, they feel that it's inherited. Vince himself talked about the other night, the idea that some of his relatives in his immediate family, his children, his siblings have depression, but then again, some of them do not. And even one of his parents also suffered from depression, but it didn't get passed on to everyone. Similarly, he talks about the idea that with other types of disorders that can bring on depression, and that is things like bipolar disorder that has a much higher connection to genetics and being based in some sort of hereditary process, that still does not explain the whole story. So even though the idea of genetics and going from one member of being passed on from one member of a family to another, there is something to that. That's not stuff that's made out of thin air. That is not the whole story. So now we fast forward to get as much of this incredible presentation in as we possibly can to some of the things that Vince talked about in terms of how he's designed this, what I'm calling a menu, this number of things that go into dealing with making your own specific, tailor-made, DIY, do-it-yourself prescription to deal with your depression.
Here's me putting together what I think tends to cause depression. And it's a whole bunch of stuff. It's not any one thing. So we already said that you might have a genetic predisposition. Another thing that can contribute to depression is some physical illnesses. So for example, you probably know that diabetes means that it's more likely that you're going to suffer from depression. Or if you have a major cardiac event, it's more likely you're going to get depressed after that. And then you might have had some really difficult life experiences. So people who have been foster children, people who have been abused as children or as older people are going to be more likely to suffer with depression. People who are in very high stress situations. And sleep. Poor sleep habits can create a greater likelihood that you're going to get depressed. And of course, if you're depressed, it can disturb your sleep in a lot of different ways. So those two go hand in glove. Doing something about having better sleep habits can be really useful. So over time, your brain does actually change. Your mood might be reduced from all of this, so you kind of start to slip into that dark place where it's going to be more likely that you're going to get depressed. You might start to experience more physical aches and pains. It's very common that your awareness of that gets heightened when you're depressed. There are some antidepressants that try to go after both the aches and pains and the depression. And your thinking might become kind of distorted. And so that's why cognitive behavioral therapy can be so effective, because it's about really looking more closely at how you're thinking and how that contributes to how you feel. When you get all of that going in the wrong direction, then you might start to feel so miserable you really don't want to be with other people. You start to isolate yourself. And guess what? That's like pouring fuel on the fire. Because depression is complex, because there are a lot of things that can contribute to it, and because there is no silver bullet for dealing with depression, we like to look at a great variety of possible approaches for dealing with it and helping people to find what are the mixture of things that work well for them. Each person needs to experiment with some different techniques and discover which can help them. In our depression recovery groups, which is a service that we've been doing for 5 years now, online, so we bring people together in web conference meetings. So this is not a chat room, it's not a forum, it's a live meeting where participants can see the person that's leading the meeting. They can see other participants if the participants want to be on camera. It's each person's choice. But they can talk to each other and they can meet with each other. We do this with people from all over the world. We've had people from almost 50 different countries in our groups now. And we've had thousands of participants over the 5 years we've been doing it. And that's become really compelling part of my recovery, just to do that work.
And I just want to pause there and point out and underscore what Vince said. He said, doing that kind of work, even though he's helping other people, is part of his own recovery. That is, doing things with others and for others helps him as well.
We rotate through 16 different evidence-based modules to help people to take a look at some different things that they ought to check out. And what I will do today is briefly touch on 5 things that I think are really important. And I'm going to end by talking about bright light therapy, which again is very appropriate, I think, at this time of the year. Stress and anxiety overlaps with depression about 2/3 of the time. When you're more stressed, it's more likely you're going to get depressed. When you're depressed, it's more likely that you're going to experience anxiety. And, the origin of having an anxious or stressful experience goes back to kind of what we were created for. We were created to be self-protective. And so our bodies are made to our lives, to our well-being. And we needed to either fight or flight, right? You've heard that phrase before. And now we have that same kind of response to things that are actually not that threatening. And as a consequence, we experience very, very high levels of stress. When we experience high levels of stress, we basically get overstressed and we can get kind of stuck. And all stress is not bad. Some stress is actually good. So, for example, if you look at the relationship between performance or being, active and stress, at a moderate level of stress, your performance is actually optimized.
And we're going to have to leave it right there for today's program. What we're going to do is, that is for our live broadcast, and about 30 minutes If you follow and pick up on the podcast, we're going to have the rest of Vince Caimano's presentation. It is amazing. He's going to be talking about light therapy and a number of the other dynamics that